Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Highway 316 podcast. I'm your host, Scott Scher, and today we're going to be talking about coincidences versus miracles, what some people would call, happenstance or coincidences. Uh, what do you do when you have a series of coincidences that happen? Uh, are they all just coincidence? Are they all just luck and chance, or is there something more involved? When does something go from being coincidental to perhaps being intervention by maybe something divine, whether you want to say God or some higher power or whatever? We're going to talk a little bit about that today, and I'm going to share three stories about what I'm calling miraculous or miracles. And I'm going to use the terms a macro miracle versus a micro miracle. And let me explain what I mean for the sake of this podcast, what I mean by that. The definition of macro just basically means large scale. Micro basically means a very small scale. So when I say macro versus micro, that's what I'm referring to. So when I say a macro miracle, I'm talking about something on a large scale versus a micro miracle, which is very insignificant and on a very small scale, something you might just totally overlook. All right. Now, what do I mean by miracle? Well, the definition of miracle, let me just pull that up really fast. One definition of a miracle: a miracle is an extraordinary event that cannot be explained by the normal laws of nature, and it's usually attributed to an act of God or higher power. Okay. Now, those who don't believe in miracles or don't see that as being relevant, there's another definition that's pretty much commonly used today for things like these. It's called serendipity. Um, I'm going to give you the meaning of what serendipitous means. Serendipitous means finding valuable, pleasant, or agreeable things by chance, luck, or unexpected good fortune, right? And a common synonym of that is coincidence. A common string of coincidences that happen that make for something very fortuitous, and it usually means something good that happens as a result of all these things. So we're going to be talking a little bit about serendipity versus what very well could be miraculous, and I'm going to share three stories. One's from the Bible, and two are from my personal life. One happened to me personally a long time ago, and the third one, which just happened last week, where I got to play a role in it. It didn't happen directly to me, but I got to be a part of it. One of these God tapping me on the shoulder moments and saying, "Hey, look at what I'm about to do. I'm about to perform what I am going to call a micro miracle." All right. Um, See you in a few minutes. So let's start with the macro. Let's start with something that's clearly a miracle that you could pretty much say what would be a great example of a miracle of God. In all four Gospels, the feeding of the 5,000 comes to mind. It's recorded in all four, and what how this basically goes is they're out in a remote place in the wilderness. There are 5,000 recorded men that are there, not including women and children. Scholars believe there could have been as much as 10 to 15,000 people there when you include the men and women as well. So, however you want to look at that, it was a large crowd in a remote section of the wilderness. They had been out there all day listening to the teaching of Jesus, right? And it started to get late. And the disciples of Jesus were getting worried because they were watching the sun go down, and all these people had been out there in the wilderness, basically, pretty far from town. and they hadn't had anything to eat, hadn't had anything for a while. So they were getting concerned about this large crowd. So they went to Jesus and they said, "Hey, Jesus, we need to stop now. Send these people away so they can go to the towns and get something to eat." And Jesus, already aware of what he was going to do, was starting to test his disciples, right? In part, he said, "They don't have to leave." He said, "You give them something to eat," right? They're looking at the crowds and they're like, "How are we going to feed this crowd? Even if we went off to the towns nearby and got food, we'd never be able to get enough for all these people." And so, they didn't know what to do. And Jesus said, "Hey, relax. I got this." And basically, he told the disciples to go gather whatever they could find. And as it so happened, there was a young boy in attendance in the crowd who just happened to have 5 barley loaves of bread and 2 little fish. Now, a loaf of barley bread back then is not like the loaf of Wonder Bread or something you think of today. It was basically just this little tiny loaf of bread used for traveling, something to eat on the way to somewhere else. So don't think 5 big loaves of bread here. We're talking 5 little tiny travel loaves and probably 2 really tiny fish. And that's what this little boy had. And nobody else had anything, but he had that. And he said, "Bring it to me." Right? And so if you can picture this massive number of people, 5, 10, possibly even 15,000 people, men, women, and children. It's getting late in the day. They're hungry. It's to the point now where sending them away is probably not good. And Jesus, he prayed. He gave thanks to God and then told his disciples to go feed the 5,000. So they've got whatever baskets or whatever that they've got. And if you could picture it, they were probably opening these baskets, and all of a sudden, all this bread, all this fish just starts coming up out of the baskets. It's not specifically described how that happened, but it did. And everybody ate, and everybody had their full. And it was pretty amazing. It's what you would definitely call a macro miracle. That's definitely something we would all look at, as Christians at least, and say that that's a miracle of God. There's no other way that could have happened, right? We're going to get back to this story, but now I want to go and share some of these other stories that have happened to me, and we'll tie this all together in at the end of the video. You need a little backstory before we can begin. This is going to center around local celebrities, Big Chuck and Little John. Now, for those of you that don't know who that is, uh, us that have grown up in Northeast Ohio, back in the day, there were these 2 comedians, basically Big Chuck and Little John, who were running a Friday night show back in the day, which started, I think, in 1979 and ran almost 30 years. And so what they would do is they would, on Friday nights, if you if you were like myself, who didn't necessarily have the best social life, you'd be home on a Friday night, and these guys would come on Channel 8, I believe, around 8 p.m. And they would host this horror show, basically, where they would play the cheesiest horror movies you could think of. And in between the movie, the commercial breaks, they would do these skits, these comedies, these cheesy comedy skits. And one particular comedy skit that's going to be relevant to this particular story is they did an ongoing series called Ben Crazy. And that's exactly how it was announced, roughly. And in the skit, basically, Big John plays the worst doctor ever, and Little John's his patient, and he's always giving him the worst advice. So just keep that in mind as we talk about this. Also, something else that's relevant to this story, Little John, aka John Rinaldi, he owned his own jewelry business. I think that he might have been doing that for like 50 years, and I think it went out of business a few years ago, and it was called Rinaldi's Jewelry. All right, so the story begins. Uh, me and a fellow coworker of mine were getting ready to leave for the day. This just happened like last weekend, and as we're walking out, it just so happens that I was with a friend of mine named Ben. And so as he's walking out, for whatever reason, I'm thinking about that show, and I say behind him, "Ben Crazy." he stops and looks at me and he says, "It's funny you should say that." And then, as it just so happens, he begins to tell me that that very evening he is going to a book signing for Little John that very night. And so we start talking about it. And then he tells me the story on the way out about how 2 years ago on Facebook Marketplace, he came across one of the Rinaldi jewelry signs. Someone was selling it. And he saw that and he thought, hey, that's great. That was 2 years ago. So he's telling me, hey, he bought this sign 2 years ago. And tonight he's actually going to a book signing for Little John. And he's hoping maybe to get an autograph or something, right? So that's pretty cool. I happen to bring that up, that joke, on the way out. And he just so happens to be going to a book signing for Little John. Okay, so fast forward the next day. Work's beginning. I'm with another fellow coworker of mine, and she's having a bad day. She's probably been having a few bad days for a while now, but I could tell that she was really not in a good mood. And I remember going to my first position at my job, and as is my custom, as I try to do, um, I pray. I pray at the start of the day, and I try to pray for people around me during the day. I prayed in particular for this one girl, for the Lord to bless her and help her have a great day. This is relevant because it's all gonna come together at the end of this story. So later on, I run into Ben, Mister Ben Crazy, and he tells me how the book signing went. It was pretty cool. He said he brought the sign. It was about yay big. It's not a very big sign, but he brought the sign to the book signing, and he said people spotted it right away while he was in line to get an autograph for Little John's book, right? And his intention was he was just going to give the sign back if they wanted it back. But he said he got up there, and it was Little John and his wife who co ran the jewelry business. They were both stoked at seeing that sign, and it blessed them and all the other people that were there at the book signing. It kind of made the event even cooler. And he ended up not only getting the sign autographed, he got a picture with Little John and his wife, and basically everybody else that was there were kind of in the picture. It was a really cool moment. He was telling me all about it. I heard that story, and I was thinking to myself, "That's pretty cool, man." I mean, and it was funny the way that all just kind of came together. If I hadn't said the joke that I said, that just so happened to tie into the story that he had and the book signing that he was about to go to, I never would have heard about it. So as we're going now, I run into the very girl, the coworker of mine who was having a bad day that I'd been praying for, and that story's still fresh in my head. And I'm thinking, you know what? I'm going to tell her this story. It'll cheer her up. That's my thought process. So I tell her about this story, about the sign and the book signing and everything about that, and how I just so happened to bring that joke up, and he just so happened to tell me that story, and he just so happened to be going to a book signing that night for Little John. After the story, she says, "It's funny you should say that." And then she proceeds to tell me, as it so happens, about 20 years ago, or maybe 30 years ago, when she was in her 20s, she used to do some modeling. And she told me that she was in several of Little John, Big John, and Little John's skits. And I'm like, wow, what are the chances of that? What Big John and Little John would do quite often for their skits is they would walk downtown Cleveland, wherever they were filming, and they would pull people off the street for like volunteers for their skits. Or sometimes they would be like my friend, and they would be present and they could pull from those people for their skits. So I thought that was pretty cool. She's telling me that she used to do several skits for Big John and Little John, Big Chuck and Little John. And I said, wow, man. I mean, can we find those anymore? She said the ones that she remembers doing were really old, back in the days of VHS. And she said she might have had one of those on VHS somewhere at her house. She doesn't know. And it occurred to me that most of those are probably online now. So I asked her to describe one of the skits to me. So she goes on to describe one of the skits. And then I leave. I get up on YouTube, type up Big Chuck and Little John, and 400 something skits pop up. And then I'm like, all right, well, I'm not going to search through all these skits. So then I type in some of the details that she was telling me about one of the skits. And then this one skit comes up. And I look at it and I'm watching the video, and there's all these like models in the video, in the skit. And I'm thinking, this looks like what she was describing to me because she was one of the models. And then it's a very short skit, but then there was this one image of a model with her back facing that looked like it could have been a younger version of the woman that was telling me about this. But I couldn't see her face. And she said in the video, you're not going to be able to see her face. So then I tell her about it later in the day, and I say, hey, check out this video and confirm whether this is you or not. And she said, all right, I'll do that. 5 minutes later, she calls me up, and then we're talking. And she said, that's me. She said, that's me from way back when. And she was so stoked by that because she said, looking back at herself, she was looking at the way her daughter looks now is the way she looked back then. And it totally made her day. Okay. So now think about all this now. Think about all this. The day before, I just so happened to walk out with a guy named Ben, and I just so happened to remember that joke from the Ben Crazy skit that Big John and Little John did, and I yelled that behind him. It just so happens that he's going to a book signing that night for Little John. The next day, I just so happened to tell a girl that I had just so happened to be praying for that day the story to cheer her up. And then it just so happens that she tells me that she used to be in Big Chuck and Little John's skits. And then I just so happened to find it very quickly, and it made her day. So what happened? God took a sign from 2 years ago from a closed jewelry business, connected all three of us in this story, and ended up answering my prayer, which he obviously knew about in advance before I was even going to pray it, and then made her day because now she told me now she can go and share that video with her daughter, and she was overjoyed by it. She really liked that, and it made her day. So I just wanted to share that story, right? Coincidence? Was that a serendipitous event, or did God orchestrate that? Was that a micro miracle, as I'm calling it? And then you have to wonder how many of these coincidences happen on a daily basis that we never see. I just happen to be at the right place at the right time to say the right things that God had orchestrated in advance. And he did all this with a sign just to go and answer a prayer to bless a girl that he already knew I was going to ask that God would bless that day. Pretty amazing stuff, I think. Not only was I blessed, because I feel like God tapped me on the shoulder and said, hey, pay attention. I'm about to do something cool, and I want you to watch it. I want you to witness it. And he blessed my friend Ben at the book signing. He blessed Little John and his wife because they were overjoyed to see that sign from their old jewelry business. And everyone else that was there in attendance that day at the signing was blessed. I was blessed. My friend who was having a bad time was blessed. And who knows how many other people will be blessed from there on. And as it so happens, I just happen to have a mediocre podcast, and now I get to share this story. So how many more people are going to be blessed? I just wanted to share that. All right, for my second story, this is more personal, and this is something that directly happened to me roughly about 1995, 1996, shortly after I got saved. Back then, God did some amazing things for me, as He often does when you're new to the faith, and everything just seems incredible when you come to Christ for the first time, and He just does all these incredible things for you. Well, anyway, uh, what happened is somewhere along there, an opportunity presented itself for myself, a friend of mine named Dean from my church, and my father, who'd gotten saved a few years before that. We were all on our way to a retreat off the coast of North Carolina, Wilmington, North Carolina. At the time, I was in Durham, so it was just a short drive over to there. The night before we went, I was praying to God in, the kind of amateurish way that I was praying back then, just talking to Him because I was still learning how to pray. And I remember asking him, because I knew I was going to the beach and it was the East Coast, and it had been a long time since I've been to the East Coast. And I remember asking him in a prayer, Lord, I was thinking of Lord of the Flies, the book Lord of the Flies that I'd learned about in school. And for some reason, I was thinking about the conch shell in the story. And I knew I was going to the beach, so I asked him. I said, Lord, wouldn't it be great if you could find me one of those conch shells? And I asked him for it. And then immediately after I asked him for it, I felt silly for asking for it. And I said, forget it, God. It's like, I'm sure you've got more important things to do than to go find me a shell. All right. So that was that. I left it alone. So the next day, we're driving out to Wilmington, North Carolina to go to this retreat. On the way, I'm telling my father and my friend Dean about the conch shell prayer, saying, it was silly I asked for that, but wouldn't it be neat? And, kind of one of those situations. So we get to the place where this retreat's going to be, and it's beautiful. It's like right off the coast. I mean, we're right there off the beach. And before we go to the place where we're going to go to, we wanted to go see the water. So we went out towards the beach. And I'm not kidding. I must have taken maybe 3 or 4 steps. And my friend Dean, who was ahead of me, was looking at me as I was doing it. And he said, stop. Look. And he pointed down at my foot. I said, look. I'm like, what? He said, look at your foot. And I looked down at my foot, and I'm not kidding, in the sand, just in front of where I had stepped, there was a shell. And we're looking at each other like, no way. And so I go down and I dig it up, and lo and behold, a fully intact conch shell. It just so happens that the very thing I prayed for the night before, the Lord put right in front of my path, right? Now you could say all you want, well, it's the beach, and you're going to find shells, right? I have been to many beaches. I have never found a conch shell, a fully intact one. I've seen many shells. But it just so happens that on the day we're going to the beach, and I just so happened to pray about that the night before, and I step on the beach, and I just so happen to almost step on the shell, and my friend just so happens to look down at my foot at the same time and point it out to me. I probably would have missed it. And there it was. I can't tell you what that did for me. That was incredible. I was so amazed, and I had witnesses, and they were like, no way, right? So what ended up happening that day was my father and my friend Dean, they continued on to the retreat. I didn't want to leave the beach. I sat on that beach, I don't know, for a good half an hour, just looking at that shell and hanging out with God on the beach. And it was, to this day, is still one of my favorite memories with him. And I didn't go to the retreat. I ended up just walking on the beach with God. And I ended up walking the beach, and it took me into town. I ended up at a diner, and I ended up having a conversation with a waitress in a diner. I told her the story, and that kind of opened up a conversation between me and her. And she started telling me about her son. And I can't remember all the details of how that finished, but I believe we prayed before that conversation was through. And I just remember going to the beach and walking back from town down that same beach. Just, I call it the perfect day. I mean, just everything was just, it was beautiful. And I just felt so close to God. And it all started with a shell, that I've been praying for. It reminds me of the old song, Little is Much When God is in it. I would call that another micro miracle. Others would say, wasn't that just a lucky coincidence? So you decide for yourself what that is. I just wanted to share that story. And as it turns out, I still have the shell. I'm calling it the God artifact. I have one, as it just so happens. All right, welcome back, everybody. Just to wrap this all up, I'd like to return to the original mackerel miracle that I was talking about in the beginning of the feeding of the 5,000. I didn't finish that story on purpose because I wanted to get to this point and tie it in with the rest. But after everyone had eaten and they had their fill, it says in the Bible that they gathered uh, all the leftovers, and there ended up being 12 full baskets of leftovers that were done. And the only gospel that records this is the book of John. Jesus says this in John 6, verse 12. When they had had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." All right? That's the point I want to make from this here. Yes, there's this big macro miracle that Jesus did, but picture for a moment that scene. Picture for a moment what that might have been like after the fact, right? Everybody fed. They eventually went home, or Jesus basically left, and they had all this leftovers. It's not recorded what happened to all those leftovers, but who knows how many more people Jesus might have blessed with all of those leftovers. And I think that's very significant. And that's the point I want to draw from this whole story. I want to take you now from the macro miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 and take you to the leftover bread, right? Jesus said, "Let nothing be wasted." And I think that's a great indication of exactly what God does all the time. He lets nothing go to waste. Nothing. He blesses and blesses and blesses. And the things that we would consider insignificant, he takes that little bit and he continues to make it more. We will never know probably the full extent of what he did with those leftovers. But there are plenty of things in our own lives that happen that we would consider a waste that God takes and makes a blessing, right? Whether it's if going back to my story about the shell, right? Think about this for a moment. He took a creature, a sea creature that shell used to be its home, and somehow or another, the lifespan of that creature, we don't know. I don't know. You know, when it lived and when it died, God knew everything about it. God had to take that shell, the leftovers of that creature's life, time that with whenever it died to, whenever the author of The Lord of the Flies wrote that story, and when I got around to reading it, to when I was going to be as it happened, be on that beach on that particular day, where God Himself had to take that animal, make sure it was in the tides in such a way so that we would roll upon the shore that very moment at that particular time, so that my foot could be where it was. Um, he took the leftovers of that animal's life and he made it a huge blessing. You know, if you could picture that, and all the happenstance things that would have had to have occurred for all of that to happen, right? Now take the other story that I told about Big Chuck and Little John. He took a sign that was abandoned from Little John's jewelry business. However, it came about that the person who sold it on Facebook Marketplace made it available. My friend at work, who just so happened to buy the sign, and 2 years later, he goes to a book signing, and all the things we talked about, just to take that sign, right, and use it eventually to get to the girl that I was talking about in this story, and bless her with that, and all those other people. So the point I want to make with all of this is God takes the leftovers of our lives, and He's constantly using it. Whether it's a shell washed up upon the shore from perhaps a long dead animal, or a sign from a business that had been closed down for however long, or whether it were those pieces from the feeding of the 5,000 left over in the basket, and only God knows what He did with those from there on. That's our God. That's what He does. He can take, he can do amazing things and do these macro miracles, right? That are easy to identify. The Bible records many of them. But the things we miss on an everyday basis are the micro miracles, right? The little things He does and the way He orchestrates all of these events that only God could do, which others would say is coincidence, and use that big fancy word serendipity to say, well, this is just the way things are. It doesn't have to be God. And I would argue that that's not true, because God is the one who blesses. God is the one who puts all these coincidences together, orchestrating everything behind the scenes to bless people, to do good things to people with little things, with leftover things from our lives. And we have no idea how often he does this on a regular basis. But every once in a while, he taps us on the shoulder and says, pay attention, I'm about to do something really cool. Like in the case with me getting to participate in that story with surrounding Big Chuck and Little John and that sign. God takes the leftovers of our lives and he continues to make them a blessing to other people. And he does it all the time. And I'm sure after hearing my two stories, I'm sure you could probably think back to a time where, you know what, there were some coincidences in my life at different times in my life that seemed a bit unusual. If you really thought about it, and if you really thought about it, you could see the hand of God in all these little micro miracles. And that's what that's the biggest point I'm trying to make here. Is other people would say, this is just coincidence. And coincidences happen all the time. I would say God is all about the coincidences, and he is orchestrating all kinds of things every day to bless people. And the scripture I want to leave you with is whether you're a believer or a non believer, what God says about himself is he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. And back then, rain was considered a blessing. So both of those are blessings. And God is blessing us, his creation, made in his image and likeness, every day through a series of multiple coincidences leading to good things. And you could look at the macro things that he has done, or the amazing coincidences that he did just to create this universe so that this very planet could be where it is today. Or you could go all the way down to the micro miracles, the things we overlook every day that he's all about. He's in all the details. He's doing all of these things, and most of it gets overlooked all the time. And he's blessing people constantly through these things. So be encouraged. Think about, go find some time where something like that happened. The last thing I want to leave you with is this is what God does all the time in our lives when it comes to salvation. We don't even recognize the multiple things and coincidences or the it just so happen events that occur all throughout our lives that God is orchestrating to get each and every one of us to the place where we are introduced to Jesus Christ and we get to know him and we get to believe on him. And he's been orchestrating that all the way since the beginning of your life, if not before. And those who have come to Christ can look back at a lot of those things and tie it all together and see, they can see after the fact that what they formerly thought was coincidental, they could see God's hand working in all of those little things. So I encourage you today, if you don't think God's with you, if you're having a hard time, think about something God has done in your life, and then try to track it back and see all the little things that he has done, and the amount of care and attention and detail that he places into doing something as simple as making somebody have a better day, or cheering up some young Christian like myself that just happened to find a seashell and it made my day. Because God, I guarantee you, God is doing those kind of things all the time. I hope this blessed you. I hope you get something out of this, and we'll see you next time.